Right on. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's wonderful to see you. Just by way of context, I was trying to think about being a moderator, and it's a lot harder than it was in my imagination to prepare for this. And I kept invoking it's Throwback Thursday for those who participate in Throwback Thursday, and I tried to decide, like, do I want to be Sally Jesse Raphael? Do I want to be Oprah? Do I want to be Donahue? Which dates me. But tells you by whom I was deeply informed as a person. I want to welcome you all to this very important learning opportunity for us together, and I think that it's really important to echo what Hadara said and Jessica and others, that this is an opportunity for us to be together, to learn together. And when we have an opportunity to grapple with important ideas, to think about things that really matter to us, about which we are passionate, and then to sort of weigh in a way that shapes a culture and a community to advance justice forward, I can't think of any better work to be able to do. And I can't think of a better community of colleagues and residents and activists to be able to do that with. And so by way of introduction, I want to welcome you. I'd like to introduce our guests this evening and invite you to come up onto the stage, please. I'd like to first introduce, as they make their way up, Alison Bernstein. Alison has served as Senior Deputy State Public Defender at the State Public Defender's Office for 9 years, where her primary focus is on capital defense. Alison currently serves as the past president of the Berkeley Police Review Commission, and I'd like to welcome Alison to the stage. Thank you very much. To Alison's left, I'd like to welcome Abdi Soltani to the stage. Abdi is the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California. Previously, he served as an Executive Director at Californians for Justice, the Campaign for College Opportunity, and Parsa Community Foundation. Abdi, welcome to the stage, and thank you for being here this evening. And then to my left, I'd like to welcome David Muhammad to the stage. David is the National Justice Partner at Impact Justice and serves as the lead consultant and technical assistant provider to the Sierra Health Foundation's Positive Youth Justice Initiative. David, thank you for being here this evening. So let's just go ahead and jump in and get started. Our big theme tonight is race and the law, and the way this evening is structured is we will go through sets of questions grouped around theme, and then we will find our way to a time for questions and answers from all of you, and then make our way to closure this evening. I'm going to start off with a set of framing questions or statements, and then invite you all to jump in. First, Abdi, if you would please set the stage for us. Can you talk a little bit about the history of racial disparities in arrests and incarceration in California? And tell us a little bit from your perspective what the current discourse around racial disparities in the criminal justice system looks like and what we should be looking for when we're having this conversation.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. You heard the cough. I was just going to say, I have a bit of a cough, and if it gets really bad, jump ahead to the next person, and then I'll come back to me. I'd just like to say thank you to JCRC for holding this event and creating a space to talk about the criminal justice system and to talk about race and racial justice directly. It's really important that you're doing this. I just wanted to begin by saying thank you. So on the question of talking about the history of race and the enforcement of law, I thought I would begin by, I grabbed my copy of the United States Constitution. I'm on literally Article 1, Section 2. We're not far in the Constitution. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, which is the indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So right there in our Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, we don't count as a person an Indian not taxed, and we count, for purposes of apportionment, 3/5 of slaves. They were counted for the purpose of counting districts and taxation, but not counted as human beings in the circle of democracy when it was created. So the question of race and the law and the enforcement of law is right there from the beginning of our legal system. The state of California was founded in the 1850s, and among the very first acts of our state legislature was an appropriation, I believe on the order of $1 million, I think in today's dollars, literally to fund militias to go and exterminate indigenous people of this state. And so one of the very first acts of our state government was to fund a race-based system of law enforcement whose purpose was execution, different than the executions today. So the origin of this is deep. It's been reinforced by decades of law, of practice, of policy, and of ideas. Very briefly, the civil rights movement, took some of this system down. Immediately, that led to Nixon's war on drugs. That was one of the big drivers of the dramatic expansion of incarceration. With a good friend of mine, Michelle Alexander, has written a book, The New Jim Crow, which kind of replaced that system of legal segregation of Jim Crow with criminal justice. I highly recommend it. We then got the three strikes law in California in 1994, which led to a further radical expansion of our criminal justice system and other forms of mandatory sentencing, a pullback on parole, and we just kept building and adding and growing our system of incarceration, and that really brings us to today. The origins are at our founding, reinforced through decades of policy. And these are not things that can be undone in 1 year or 3 years or 5 if they took literally a couple centuries to build as strong and as robust as they are. So I will just hold there because the question's a big one, and I thought I should just go back to the origins a little and use a couple minutes that way.
That's an important start. Thank you, Abdi. David, in 2014, you wrote an article titled 20 Years of Flawed Criminal Justice Policy. 2 years have passed. A lot has happened in this country with regard to racial justice. What's your perspective on some things that have changed, some things that have improved, and maybe things that have regressed in some way?
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. And I got the invitation, I said, wow, how did they know that my fiance was Jewish? This is somebody saw me at her son's bar mitzvah, I don't know. But it might just be because I work in this field. My fiance, who is just landed off of a plane in LA, is trying to get here in London. That's probably why my phone is going crazy. So I'm just turning it off because it's incredibly annoying. I wrote a column looking at 20 years since the crime bill passed. And this is the infamous crime bill that President Bill Clinton passed. And so we talked about Nixon's war on drugs, which was the beginning, not the beginning, but a significant escalation in massive incarceration in this country. But really what got it going to the point that we have now is this crime bill, right? From a Democrat, Bill Clinton. If you look back, unfortunately, pushed very hard by the Congressional Black Caucus in support of it. That was draconian in many measures. Bill Clinton has since apologized on her presidential bid recently. His wife had to apologize about the bill, but also her comments about it at the time, where she called youth super predators. There was a video where she had to apologize for that video that came from a study that was done. That study is almost solely responsible for numerous horrific laws all across the country. The authors of that study that said there was going to, because of crack babies and the crack epidemic, there was going to be this new generation of super predators who were going to kill us and rob us and everything else, and which never came to pass. And the authors of that study apologized for an entirely false study. So I just want to say a few things about that crime bill. that passed the Clinton crime bill. So it mandated, passing 94, it mandated longer prison sentences, something that they used to call the truth in sentencing, where it said you had to do the entirety of your sentence and no time off for good behavior. So we talked about parole being diminished at some point. It created the 3 strikes, and so in order for states to receive money, a humongous amount of money, $30 billion that this crime bill gave available to the states. In order to receive the money, you had to enact these truth in sentencing and 3 strikes laws. It also eliminated most education programs in prison. Again, some things that just don't make a lot of sense. When we're supposed to be rehabilitating and preparing people for release, they cut prison programs, they cut rehabilitation programs. California at that time literally took it very seriously and removed the word rehabilitation from its name in penal code. Under Governor Schwarzenegger, actually they put it back in. It's about all they did, not a lot of work. They just put their word back in. Ironically, as we kind of know instinctually, but since then several reports have shown that education is the single best impact on reducing recidivism. So a RAND study recently showed that a 40% reduction in recidivism if someone completes an education program while in custody. And of course, there's a humongous racial and ethnic disparities that are really astronomical that we know that exist. And so one thing I just want to read is, even though white and black people use drugs approximately equal rates, black people are 10.1 times more likely to be sent to prison for drug offenses. Today, black Americans represent 56% of those incarcerated for drug crimes, even though there's just 13% of the U.S. population. There's more black people incarcerated in America than there were under the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so these are horrible numbers, staggering. And so I see that time, I think they lied to me. I can't believe I spoke for 4 minutes just now. But so that is where things have been. It is for the most part where things are. I must say in a later question, maybe I'll get to the point that there has been some tremendous progress, particularly on the juvenile side. So in the state of California, there's been a 90% reduction in incarceration in youth in the state system, and a significant incarceration in county-by-county systems is incredibly encouraging. But we have not seen anything like it on the adult side, even with the extraordinary reforms, Prop 47 and many other things. There is still a massive incarceration on the adult side of California throughout the country, and I hope to get into that in some later questions.
Thank you, David. Alison, we just heard about some of the progress that's happened in the youth area, and your experience, your significant experience as a defense attorney in death penalty cases. And give us a sense of, through the lens of racial disparities, what concerns you most that you see in your role?
Sure. These are really big questions. And a lot of what has already been said here, just keep in mind as I'm talking. One of the big things, when I look at it through the lens of capital punishment, all of our clients come to us seriously damaged. They have significant mental health issues. They have significant cognitive impairment issues. These are the kinds of things that kind of are the predicates of someone engaging in the kind of conduct that our clients have engaged in. And then when we look at what are the risk factors that lead to mental health and cognitive impairments, poverty, malnutrition, stress, familial stress, poor education system. What is the one thing that tends to make a difference? And I say this looking at every single person in the room, a single point of contact with a major adult who is willing to step in and stand with you. Frequently in our cases, we have one brother, a family from a horrific background, abuse that is beyond staggering, 2 brothers, one is my client and one is not. What's the difference? The one who's not had someone who's willing to step in, take them by the hand, and create an intervention. That's what resilience relies on, that human intervention. So that's not exactly answering your question, but I want to talk about that because it is really important. So we see the kinds of risk factors that lead to people like our clients are seriously linked to race. We also see significant racial bias in prosecution. Alameda County had been notorious. At one point, The difference, the highest likelihood of being charged with a capital crime, and virtually every murder in the state of California can be charged as a capital crime, which is a different conversation. That leaves an incredible amount of discretion up to the DA. If you were a black defendant who killed a white victim in eastern Alameda County, your chances of being charged with the death penalty were astronomical. The exact same crime, white victim, white perpetrator, other part of Alameda County, much lower chance. And we see those kinds of numbers throughout the state. Geographically, it is much more likely that you're going to see an African American or Latino client charged with the death penalty. The other big factor that leads to higher charging in the death penalty is what's called gang allegations. But anyone who's been reading about gangs realizes gangs are no longer a question of membership, they're a question of geography. So entire neighborhoods, any crime perpetrated in those neighborhoods will get a gang enhancement if it's a non-capital case. And if it's a capital case, the jury will hear all about gang violence. I was reading one transcript recently. Again, it's a horribly tragic case, and one of the victim impact witnesses, and this is in a capital case, where the families of the victims come in and talk about what has happened and the impact of the loss. The family member is asked some question, and he looks, I'm reading the cold transcript, but you imagine this pause, and he says, "You're talking about gang members. That's everyone. That's every one of my uncles. That's every one of my cousins. That's everyone in my family. We all belong. This is the part of San Bernardino. It's called West Verdugo. Everyone is WSB. You can't live here and not be WSB." So this concept of gangs and the way it permeates and is used to greatly increase the kinds of incarceration our clients see is really significant.
Thank you, Alison. So we started off talking about incarceration, but let's back up a little bit, because things like implicit bias affect everything from police stops through sentencing that then express in terms of incarceration. Abdi, can we start with you? Will you first define for us what implicit bias is? And then can you talk with us a little bit about the negative impacts of implicit bias as it relates to law enforcement?
Sure. So the concept of implicit bias is the basic idea that racism is so deep and so pervasive, so saturated in our media, in the images we see on television, in commercials, in news, that it seeps into the brain and it's there whether we want it or not, and that it's not a matter of being a good person or a bad person. Implicit bias related to race is embedded in America, as it has been embedded in our Constitution and in the blood that drenched the soil of this earth and this land. And I will say, it's burned into my brain too. The fear that I feel at night when two young black men are walking behind me on the street is different than if it's two white men. Actually, sometimes not. But I will set that aside. But you get what I'm saying. It's there. We don't have to be George Wallace and segregationists or a willful person with malice to have race and racism influence our behavior and our choices. That's the idea of implicit bias. That it's there, it affects our choices without us even knowing it. The reason that this concept is important is a few-fold. First, from the point of view of the law, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which was adopted after slavery, provides us equal protection under the law. And subsequent court decisions have said that to prove discrimination under federal law and in the federal courts, you have to show an intention of discrimination. So the idea of implicit bias is important legally because we're trying to persuade the courts that even if someone didn't have malice, race can still affect the outcome and that needs to be considered. The second is that when you're dealing with institutions, nobody wants to be told they're a bad person. And so it's a way to talk with law enforcement leaders in a way that it's not about blame, it's just about it being there. So that's the concept behind it, but also why strategically it's important in the law, and then strategically it's important in institutional change. On a practical level, implicit bias works in several ways. Police officers have to make decisions about who to stop, who to search, who to arrest. And so these images and these ideas will affect those decisions. Once an officer makes an arrest, a prosecutor has to make a decision about which cases to bring forward and to charge. Judges will make decisions. Juries will make decisions. Parole boards will make decisions. Human beings are involved in each of these steps. And so when you compound the magnitude of the police traffic stop to the decisions about arrests, who's charged, what are they charged for, who's offered rehabilitation and treatment, which kid with marijuana in their pocket before marijuana policy started to change was given an alternative, and which young people at the college I went to, none of them went to jail for marijuana possession, and so on. But then it goes up a notch at the institutional level. Policymakers, legislators, budget passers. And then it goes up another notch to the level of citizens and voters. So when that report about the predators, the crack babies, was written, what are those words triggering? But what was the implicit bias in the mind of the American electorate that even people of goodwill, people who did not think of themselves as racist, could rally behind that idea and compel laws like that to have overwhelming bipartisan support? So this is the cycle of implicit bias through which ideas are there, they gain the power of law, the people in the institutions act with their implicit bias with a set of laws that push them into structural racism, which then reinforces the idea that black people are criminals, which then keeps this cycle going. That's why it's important to have spaces like this so we can be more explicit and unpack this consciousness so we can lead to different choices and do it for a while.
Thank you, Abdi. David, Abdi talked about police implicit bias being seen at the police level, with judges, with juries, with parole boards, in the systems and in the institutions. Talk with us a little bit about the impact of racist implicit applications of implicit bias at all these levels and how it affects communities of color, especially our youth of color.
So there's a lot here. So I'll try to. So some of the first police in America were so-called slave catchers, right? So when slaves ran from the plantation to get them back, even if to go into free areas or even free slaves, right? So now we have the luxury of 12 Years a Slave as a movie to learn a little bit about that. And then you have, from that, you have the Bull Connor segregation, Jim Crow South, and you have from that extraordinary police brutality, the birth of the Black Panthers in Oakland, largely because of police brutality. We have some of the greatest images of the Rodney King beating, and of course in the last 2 years, image after image after image after image of horrible brutality. And so that, one of the training I'm involved, I work very closely with the police department here in Oakland, and they're in the process of, because they were sued, right? So you had a group of police officers called the Riders in West Oakland who were planting drugs, stealing, beating, just pretty horrible. They all got arrested and indicted, and one fled to Mexico, and others, it's just a bad situation. But based on that, there was a federal probe and a lawsuit and a negotiated settlement agreement with the police department here. And part of the response to that, and there's been tremendous responses. I can talk about how well the police are doing in Oakland. It's not normally my shtick, but I must say things are significantly improving while there's still humongous issues. But this training that we do called Procedural Justice, about the basic thing of you should treat people with respect and dignity. It really is that simple, and it really is that difficult to train around understanding how important that is. But part of how we try to get police officers to understand this, I didn't do anything, but they see me as bad as soon as I roll in. I said, well, with all that history, it's just somebody took your credit card and ran and destroyed your credit history and credit score. You didn't do it, but you have some responsibility and you feel the effects, right? So you owe a debt based on the history of policing in communities of color. And so the impact is with all of that history and with all, and the other thing, a friend of mine who is a police officer, and some of the police officers I work with in Oakland who are best in this, no coincidence, were born and raised in Oakland. Some extraordinarily wonderful police officers, the captain of the area in which we sit now, the West Oakland captain, which includes this district, Lamont Armstrong, born and raised in Oakland. His brother was killed in gun violence in Oakland. Just a wonderful human being who, another person we work with on the police force who says, I hate cops because of some of these issues. But Lamont was telling me, and I normally don't tell the story and say it to him, he was saying, we have some police officers who live in Nevada. They come and do their 3 on, 4 off, 4 on, 3 off in terms of days working, and then go back to Nevada. And when they come on, and you're doing call to call if you're a patrolman, meaning you get in your car, your board lights up on 911 calls for you to respond to. And your only interaction with the Black community or the Latino community is responding to 911 calls of traumatic, distressful situations. And you live in Nevada where there's not too many at all people of color, and your experience growing up wasn't. And now you're shaped, in addition to everything on TV and what you've seen and whatever else, your actual experience is now shaped around this. And so it's almost normal, I'm not going to excuse it, but it's almost normal that your perspective is what it is based on that. And then when people respond with seeing a Black person walking down the street and I'm going to pull them over, it is really bad in terms of that relationship. There are things we can do. So Jennifer Eberhard at Stanford University is doing an unbelievable job with implicit bias. You find her website somewhere. You can take a test, your own racial implicit bias test. It's a very good thing to do, and we all have our implicit bias. If you want to really take it, you can go to the shoot, don't shoot simulation that police departments do, which is very difficult, right? You go into, and this is you shooting someone or not. They have these simulators that really test your implicit bias because we all have it. Now, as I told them, is if you take a citizen, because they always like to say, the citizen came in and they were worse than the police. I said, I would imagine you're a trained professional who does this for a living. I would hope that you're better than the person coming in from off the street, regardless of their race. So one of the best things we could do is I talked about the assistant police chief of Oakland, Paul Figueroa, one of the best people I know, period, cop or not, born and raised in Oakland. The captain of West Oakland, Lamont Armstrong, born and raised in Oakland. There are 750 officers we have about right now. If we had 700 officers who were born and raised in Oakland, we would have an entirely different situation with the police department. And that's the biggest. I can go on and list about things that we should do with procedural justice training, implicit bias, blah, 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 blah. But if we had more born and raised in Oakland police officers, we would have a different situation.
Thank you, David. Alison, we heard about implicit bias and the way it expresses. We heard that it expresses as sometimes just mistrust or assumptions, sometimes as biased traffic stops, sometimes as police brutality, sometimes as questionable deaths while in police custody. Talk to us about this concept of transparency, and would more transparency in sharing data about things like police stops or the use of video cameras, would that affect the way implicit bias is experienced right now, and what does transparency really look like?
Boy, David got to talk about a lot more fun issues. Okay, so implicit bias, I completely agree with everything that's being said. What is complicated, very, very complicated, is what do we do with this data? The city of Berkeley now has a portal where you can go and look at our data for traffic stops, and I think we have pedestrian stops up now, if not now, very, very soon. And the data clearly shows it's a huge problem. Hugely disproportionate number of African American and Latinos are stopped, they're searched more often, their detentions take longer. Okay. How big a problem is it and what does it mean? Well, the problem is, and maybe it doesn't matter, because for Berkeley the problem is so big, you know that we got to do something differently, and I think our chief and our command staff is committed to doing it. But when you talk generally about how do we look at the data, San Jose did something a while ago, maybe 6 years ago, and they showed that their stops showed a slightly higher percentage of young men of color being stopped than were in the city. Maybe 10% higher. Now the chief released it thinking, this is great. And he got lambasted by the community. But the problem is, it doesn't make sense to use the community, the population of that city as your denominator. Because people travel through cities all the time. So what is our denominator? And I think anyone who's honest about this is going to tell you, we really don't know what the right denominator is. Should the right denominator be the people in prison? Well, that won't work because we know that we've got a lot of biases that go into who's in prison. Should the denominator be, I don't know. So we do need the data. The data is helpful. To me, I'm not an expert in this area, but I think the data is helpful writ large. When you've got numbers like Berkeley has, you've got a problem. When you've got numbers like San Jose had when they released the data, quite honestly, I'm not sure that data really showed a huge problem. As to video cameras, again, so let me back up. I think we need to get the data. I think we need to be careful about what we do with the data and use it as a marker. It is not a determination of anything. As to video cameras, again, it's a very difficult question. Certainly, having cameras gives us another set of eyes. However, there's some really interesting studies about the way video is perceived by jurors. Fascinating study. You put together a mock jury, put a witness in front of them, they'll come away with some perception of the witness's credibility. Put that same witness up as video testimony, the credibility of the witness through the roof. Why is that? I don't know. People are weird. But the truth is that we respond better to film than to real life. Somehow it gets an additional stamp of authenticity. So now, I'm an officer and I'm wearing a video camera. What does the video camera show you? What I see. As I turn, the video camera turns. So if we have video footage, it is going to give extra authenticity to the perception of the officer. Because the officer will testify, and then the video will testify. And the video can always only show you what the officer saw. So again, I think video is useful, it's interesting, it's very limited. I think it has a possibility for unintended consequences. I can tell you in Berkeley, and I'm already on record about this, I am not in favor of it because it is hugely expensive. Berkeley's a small city. We have, I think, 170 officers. San Jose anticipates if they go to video cameras for every officer, it will require 2 full-time officers just to maintain the data. I'm not sure that in Berkeley we have the kind of problem the video will solve. It's a little bit like my kids. I don't mean to make light of the seriousness of police brutality, but my kid says I want an iPhone 6. I'm like, yeah, it's good to want things. You might get one. Except your grandpa got one for him. But we don't have that luxury. It's very, very expensive, and I think we need to think carefully about what we invest in as a community. The federal government is going to make video, is going to do a big push to make more, to make video cameras available to more officers. It's going to be more departments. It's going to be a limited grant. And the same people who brought you tasers are bringing you video cameras and the storage equipment, and they're making a ton of money. The other thing to be careful of is they bankroll the studies. And you have to be very careful about those studies. Berkeley just had a group from Stanford do a great study on tasers. This group went through all the studies, did a meta-analysis, threw out about 1/3 of them as really not worth the paper they were written on because Taser International paid for the study, and it just didn't hold up when you put it down, when you kind of looked at the validity of the study. So these are complicated issues. They're interesting. I don't think our answer is in technology. I think our answers in the kinds of things that David's talked about. And I think increasingly we have departments that are committed to that, which is great.
Thank you, thank you. Let's step back a little bit and go from some micro policies to some big picture policies in terms of mass incarceration and which kind of policies might help reform the outcomes that we're seeing right now. If you would start us off, the ACLU appears to support drug policy reform. Could you talk to us a little bit about that perspective and how it would affect mass incarceration outcomes?
Sure. So nationwide, drug sentences, incarceration for drug possession, simple drug possession is the bottom. That's a little bit of drugs in your pocket. Where that relates to the police traffic stop or the pedestrian traffic stop is that when you have racially biased stops that lead to a search of a person or a vehicle, and you have drug laws of the kind we have with very long sentences, even for things like simple possession, those are some of the big institutional drivers of large-scale incarceration for really low-level behavior that has huge racial disparities. The college kids at Stanford University were not being stopped or having their dorm rooms searched for marijuana. The kids in West Oakland, where I moved to after I graduated from college, they're being stopped and frisked by those riders, officers, and then planting drugs to another level. So drug policy is a cornerstone of criminal justice reform because it's in that category of human behavior that's widespread, racially equal in terms of drug consumption on the whole, but leads to big incarceration numbers and big racial disparity. In California, we've made a lot of progress with first decriminalizing simple marijuana possession. This November, there will be a ballot measure to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana. I co-chaired a commission with Lieutenant Governor Newsom that issued the report upon which much of this ballot measure is drafted. We also worked to reduce the penalty for simple drug possession for more serious drugs like cocaine and so on from felony to misdemeanor. We tried that 4 years in a row in the legislature and couldn't do it. It got watered down, vetoed, you name it, until Prop 47 was put on the ballot by our partners, Californians for Safety and Justice. I think for the Jewish community and the principles of rehabilitation, treatment, mental health, opportunity, the way that you would work with a young person in your family who has a drug problem, and asking for that to be the public policy of our counties, of our state, and of our federal government, I think could be a very nice extension of probably the values that your families espouse, and if I were more learned, and there may be some principles in the good book, the Torah, that might come in too. But it goes far beyond drug policy. I'd like to also really frame a critical question, which is bail and the incarceration of those who are awaiting trial. In California, half of our incarcerated population is in state prison. About half are in our county jails. In those jails, on average, more than half are awaiting trial. And of those, many, if not most, because they are too poor to pay bail. The principles of racial justice and economic justice don't come anywhere as close to each other as in this instance, where literally your wealth, your assets, your income are your ticket to freedom, not only in the period of pretrial, but also then the leverage that a prosecutor has to get a plea deal. If you're locked up in jail awaiting trial, you're much more likely to plead guilty, even if you're innocent, or instead of fighting it, and then you have a felony potentially on your record. I think the reform of the bail system and replacing and ending money bail with a system that's based on evidence and on getting people to trial through means other than economic coercion, I think has to be a cornerstone of the next round of work, coupled with some more difficult sentencing and parole reforms. Our adult prison population now tends to be people with violent crime. And we do have to be a voice for addressing not just nonviolent crime, but we have to also be willing to look at people who have been convicted of violent crime and look at that differently.
Thank you. Alison, we also know that reforming mandatory sentencing is discussed and has an impact on the way the numbers of people who are incarcerated, but also the extent to which policy, whether it be formal policy or implicit bias, is expressed in the sentences that people get when they are incarcerated. Talk to us about the value of reforming maximum sentences.
Sure. I mean, I think in general the discussion about mandatory sentencing is focused on the federal sentencing guidelines, and that's not an area that I am well versed in. There is pending, we've been talking about it for years, what we call a sentencing omnibus bill in California, which would also change the way we do sentencing here. The basic idea is that we tend to say these are bad people who did bad things, and no matter what the law is, the Californians will vote for it. The last bill, I think, was Marcy's law, and I think the DA Association came out against it, the Sheriff's Association came out against it, everybody came out against it, and it still passed. And so we have to start educating ourselves about this concept about proportionality. Right now, so what we need in California, although we do need sentencing changes, we do need to move away from the way we do sentencing, which is where the aggravated term tends to be very, very high. We have tons of enhancements, many of which are linked to this concept of gang activity. The other thing we need to do is to return to the idea of proportionality, which has been lost. Californians need to come to understand that if you commit, I mean, it used to be a violent crime was about 4 years in prison. Now, a violent crime is easily 12 years in prison. Nothing has really changed. In fact, the numbers have gone down in terms of violence. But we have become obsessed with this idea of getting more and more pounds of flesh from people who engage in bad acts. And the problem is putting people in prison doesn't do anything except for make it more likely that they're going to learn to continue to do bad acts. So we need to become committed as a community to seeing people as more than their worst moment. And this is something that Brian Stevenson, I think, has brought to all of us, that none of us should be defined as people by our worst moment. Think about how that would be for each of us. But that's what we do. We need to be willing to stand up and say, yes, this person engaged in a horrible act, and yes, they need to be punished. But they do not need to be punished by 15 years in prison. That is simply too long. And folks, I'm talking about really looking at what we do with people who are child molesters, been convicted of child molestation, other sex crimes. We are now turning those into life sentences. The Sexually Violent Predator Act is now the way that the DSM-5 has been rewritten. If you are convicted of rape, you could spend the rest of your life in prison. The first 6 years in prison and the rest of it as a sexually violent predator who is never going to be able to get away from the DSM-5 diagnosis of they've now made rape kind of a mental illness, which it may or may not be, but the point is, once you get that mental illness diagnosis, you can be sent into what they call a civil institution, which is essentially prison, except for that everyone there also committed a sexually violent crime. I'm not saying that sexually violent crimes should ever be looked on lightly. I'm suggesting that the rest of your life in prison is disproportionate. That's not going to change because the easiest thing for a legislator to do is vote yes on another pound of flesh until people like us say that's enough. We need to back down. So I think what we need here in the state of California, less than kind of the mandatory sentencing issue, which is very important on the federal system, is to stand up and be courageous about saying we do not need to continue to add punishment upon punishment upon punishment upon people who have indeed committed really horrific crimes.
Thank you, Alison. We're going to take one more question for David, and then we're going to move to the questions that you all have either submitted over the computer or on these cards. So David, we know that you also were Chief Probation Officer in Alameda County, and you have had the opportunity to receive folks coming out of the incarceration experience. We heard from Abdi that things like treatment, mental health support, opportunities are really essential to success. But from your experience, what are the key factors in positioning people to be successful once they are out of the justice system?
So I just got to make a few contextual comments about things I either forgot or didn't, but that go to this is, so incarceration in and of itself is ineffective, harmful, and excessively expensive. I'm not saying this from my emotional advocacy part, I'm saying this from a scientific research factual piece. It's ineffective, it does not work for what it's intended in terms of being a deterrent, and because people come out much more likely to commit crime if you just hold for incarceration in and of itself. Secondly, harmful. A lot of people are further harmed, traumatized by the incarceration experience itself. Excessively expensive in California, adult $65,000 a year. A youth in the juvenile state system in California, it costs $200,000 and $20,000 per year per youth. It's unbelievable, right? And so now that being said, read my bio was one project. I was very happy she would go down the list, so I work on 8 different projects right now. Most of them are around reducing the size of the justice system, improving outcomes for young people. One of them in Oakland is about actually focusing on arrests. Now, but that is about trying to actually reduce arrests, but focus on folks who are imminent public safety risks who are engaged in gun violence, and trying to focus police attention on that and defocus on everything else around simple drug possession, riding your bicycle down the street or on the sidewalk, the stupid stuff and the racially biased stuff that police engage in, and focus on the things that are around public safety that people care most about. But even that doesn't mean the rest of your life, right? And so somebody who has committed gun violence, I think that person should be out of society for some period of time. I don't think that they should be forever out of society for the rest of their lives. So I just need to say that. So and regardless of everybody in prison, the vast majority are coming home anyway. More than 95% are going to come home. And therefore, we need to prepare them much better. It's absurd what currently happens in our prisons around the lack of education opportunities, the lack of rehabilitation opportunities, the lack of treatment opportunities. And when they get out, they need the big 5, what I call plus the 1. The big 5: housing, employment, education, drug treatment, mental health services. The big 5. The plus 1 is either most important or is about including in the big 5 is a healthy relationship with a positive adult. Right? I think we talked about earlier. And that is more potent than anything, is when you have a healthy relationship with a positive adult. That makes all the other 5 programs more effective. But that in and of itself is transformative. Right? And so we need to focus our time. The last thing I'll just say is, if we move in a way that criminal justice starts to focus, as it should, just on the much higher risk, more issues around public safety, the vast majority of the people in it don't reach that threshold, right? If we focus it there, then we take the savings, the billions of dollars we would save if we did that, and reinvested that into the communities that most of the people we were locking up come from. That is what we're talking about, and truly transforming the communities, the neighborhoods, our society in a way that is helpful and healthy.
Well, Ilana's not looking, I'm going to jump in on that for a quick second. So I want people to recognize that this is the opposite of the broken windows theory, the opposite of the broken windows theory. And the second thing is to point out that what most of our police are spending their time on are people with mental illness. They are not well suited for that. Everyone agrees with what David is saying. It's what they're doing in Richmond, it's what they're doing in Oakland. You identify, and the police know. They know the 50 people in Oakland, the 50 people in Richmond, the 8 people in Berkeley, because it's really, really small. Let's let them focus there, and let's bring in mental health treatment folks who can work with the folks with mental illness. So this is a huge shift that we need to continue to encourage our law enforcement to work towards.
Alison, I want you to keep going with that. Thank you for the many questions that you all have submitted, and we'll get through some. When you started off, you talked with us about the backgrounds of those with whom you're working, and they often have had abusive situations that they're coming out of. They've had experiences in their home the family backgrounds that in some ways predispose them to being more vulnerable. And can you talk with us a little bit about sort of the effects of racism in terms of the stress and the trauma and the mental health of those with whom you're seeing in your communities? Alison, you can start us. I know you all may have something to say about that.
Sure, and I'll try and be really brief. And let me say this. So one part of my practice is I write what are called habeas petitions, where we lay out the mitigation case that should have been laid out for our clients. And every single one of my African American clients, the story begins with slavery. Now, whether that's because the family was living, the grandparents were still living on the plantation where the family had traditionally been enslaved, or whether it's because the grandfather was killed when a black community was destroyed in the late 1800s, when the white communities came in and began destroying all black communities in Arkansas, or whether it's because the family was all on working on the plantation. It wasn't the original plantation, but they're still working in the plantation, still oftentimes living in traditional slave quarters. These are the stories of our clients. So it's not only the incredible poverty and the abject poverty that people are coming out of, it's the psychic burden of living in this story. One of my colleagues we had a case in Louisiana. She went to see the family, and literally they took her to the part of the slave quarters where the slaves were whipped. And so here is a child in 2006 taking a white attorney from California, and this is the history they're still living with. So Abdi talked about our history. That history is really, truly present for a lot of families. All of my African American clients were part of the Great Migration, came here in the 40s and 50s, that families came here. And so there's a way that these stressors have impacted communities, along with the way that African Americans have been disempowered and have had difficulty getting equal access to jobs, which leads to poverty, which lead to all the kinds of stressors that we see. So I wouldn't say that anyone is predisposed. I would say that we've created an incredibly racist society that's left huge segments kind of vulnerable because we've made it that way. We have made this choice as a society, and this is what you get.
I have two questions that are sort of related, but I also think require just a data check from all of you. One of the questions is about black-on-black crime, and wonders, is it really, I'm changing this question, by the way, to an inquiry, which is it a major problem? And sort of what's the real statistics on black crime, and is it really implicit bias if personal experience and statistics show that a large percentage of crimes are committed by young blacks? So there's some assumptions baked in there, and could you help us understand what the real picture looks like?
First, thank you for the question and asking it rather than holding those assumptions and biases. Trump tweeted out something about 6 or 7 months ago, it was early on, maybe a year ago, and he was saying it, and even unfortunately the former mayor of New York, I was the deputy commissioner of New York probation, and so I ran the adult probation department in New York City, so the percentage of crimes committed against black people by black people is extraordinarily high. It is almost the same of percentage of crimes committed against white people by white people, against Latino people by Latino people, right? And so if you just isolate black-on-black crime is 80% or 85% of all crime committed against black people is by black people. Yes, that's true. So is 80% of all crime committed against white people by white people, right? And so it is, and that's just how we operate and behave in society. That being said, yes, black crime is a problem, no question. But understand that is generally, so that the tweet he sent out was deliberately factually incorrect. And so the issue of experience, right? And so the question is the experience based upon racial bias or racism, right? So white and black people use drugs at about the same rate. Today, some would argue white people use drugs at a higher rate. And so numbers is way more white people, but a rate in terms of proportional to population. But because of the huge Oxycontin and heroin epidemic that is hitting white communities hard, right? So New York Times front page cover story, white death rate higher than it's ever been in history, right? And so, which may have got some of the right-wing folks supporting criminal justice reform, but the arrest. Just slightly cynical. I thought I was the less cynical person on the stage. And so if you're getting, if that officer that I described who commutes from Nevada to be an Oakland police officer and his only experience is responding to 911 calls where black and brown assailants are being pursued, then yes, that is building up his experience, his psyche, and his mentality. But if it's a falsely skewed piece around when we call police, and so I was talking about how the Stanford students' rooms weren't being shaken down. I remember this, I'll just say this story. I was in Washington, D.C., and a friend of mine said, I went to the hospital for something. He said, man, it was crazy. I went in the hospital, and I went to Georgetown in the hospital, and there were about 70 students in the emergency room. There was this humongous brawl at this sporting event. He said, so I left, I went to turn the TV on, because I knew, of course, it was going to be on television. Right, of course not. Right, but 10 students fight at a high school, black students fight in high school. I didn't say these 75 students were all white, right, in the Georgetown hospital. 10 students fight at the high school, and it is leading the nightly news. And so that type of bias, even with experience, personal experience, we must unearth and challenge. And a part of the training for police officers is your experiences are real. We can't discount your real experiences, but to understand some of these dynamics about, because let me just say again, I'm sorry I'm going over, but you talked about the different levels of racial and ethnic disparities in decision making in the system, because everybody tries to pass the buck. The police say, we're only responding to 911 calls of service. We can't, and we're only arresting who, we're seeing committing crimes, right? We can go into that. And then they take, in the youth, they take the young person to probation, and adult, they take them to the sheriff's office, and detention decisions, right? So probation departments and sheriff's departments are deciding who to detain. And then in court, they're deciding who to retain in detention and who to adjudicate going further. And then if convicted or not, on the juvenile side, disposition and sentencing on the adult side, that all wrapped with racial and ethnic disparity decisions, and then parole decisions, violations of probation. So I swear the last point. So I said to my probation officers when I was the head of probation here, and they were saying, one, we're mostly black probation officers, and we're only getting who the court send to us, who were sent to them by the police. I said, well, 50% of people on probation in Alameda County are black, even though only 13% of the population in the county is black. 50% of people on probation are black in Alameda County, but 80% of the violations of probation that probation officers were filing were for black people. I said, that's on you, probation officers, right? Maybe you're not responsible for the 50%, but that disparity between who you have and who you're submitting violation probation on, and I say that to say is at every level, we have this relative rate index of who the decisions you're making, how implicit is it in those decisions. And with police officers who have an extraordinary amount of discretion of not bringing you in or not giving you a notice to appear or just counseling and release, who are they doing that versus they're not doing that?
Can I just give two very quick answers? On the implicit bias question, it is true that a disproportionate number of the people who are arrested are young African American men in this area. However, and this fact was given to me by a friend of mine who's a Berkeley cop, but most young African American men are not committing crimes. Hold on to that fact, he told the other officers in the room. That's the number you need to keep in mind. Not the number you stop, but the fact that most young African American men are not committing crime.
Vast majority.
Vast majority. One of the really quick thing, gentleman named George Woods has done great work. Depression in young African American men shows up very differently than it does in white women and white men. So oftentimes, one of the things we see is our clients have actually been depressed their entire lives. But the way they manifest that depression, this has to do with, we have to look at how we come up with diagnostic criteria. Our diagnostic criteria has to be as multiracial, for lack of a better term. It has to be informed by the way different communities present mental illness so that we don't continue to penalize people for mental illness and get them the treatment that they need, which is a huge problem in the young men of color community. I'm talking more about African American men. I believe it to be equally true with Latino men. I have not had enough experience with Latino clients who are presenting those issues to be conversant in it, but I would imagine it's also true.
So we have a number of questions about what the Jewish community can do, and I'd like to start with you, but I'm going to mash them up together and just make it compound and complex. A number of the questions talk about the white privilege that some Jews have, or wealth, or in terms of proportional. And I will just say to the audience, I was doing a presentation on Monday, and just some quick data points. In 2010, the net wealth for Jewish households in this country was about $91,000. For African Americans, it was $6,400. At the same year, about 1 million African Americans were incarcerated, while 4,000 Jews were incarcerated. About 1 out of every 100 African American women is incarcerated. Can't even tell you how many Jewish women are incarcerated that I can't find the data. So just to give you a sense of the context. With all of that in mind, what is, and as the Jewish community grapples with racial justice, both inside of the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community, what's one powerful thing that you can advise the Jewish community to do in response to the issues we've been discussing tonight?
I'll start. I'd say first, just do any one thing. I think the one thing you could do is to just do one thing. And that would be a tremendous contribution and a great start. How you choose that one thing to start with is its own answer, which I'll now offer. One of the activities, I'm going to get very tactical, to what's something that JCRC and your congregations and the temples could do, which would be a game changer, would be to put together a program through which you interview candidates for the prosecutor, the elected district attorney, and sheriff, and ask them questions about what scope of policy direction they would pursue to reduce incarceration, to emphasize rehabilitation, treatment, and alternatives to incarceration, and to consciously apply steps to reduce racial disparities. If the Jewish community in the counties that JCRC in this region and the Jewish community nationally and in more difficult counties were to do that activity with those 3 questions, it would be a game changer. Because these elected officials, who are among the most powerful, are not used to constituencies being organized to hold them elected, hold them accountable at the point of election and then in subsequent steps. So I'm jumping to like a very kind of programmatic suggestion, but I think that the purpose here is for JCRC to embrace some principles and then to take those principles and move them into action. And I think that would be a very coherent program that can be geographically consistent, galvanizing for the community, and put you in alliance, as we began with the beautiful words, with people who are impacted by this issue disproportionately on the other side, with the Black community. If JCRC partnered with NAACP, with Black clergy, with Latino communities, served as an anchor, invested some resources, manpower, and dollars, and worked as a partner. We did this in Fresno County, and it was a great success. And though we didn't endorse the candidate, because the ACLU is nonpartisan and we don't endorse candidates, the act of coming together and the act of asking questions that are different and that fire on different synapses on the brain, that instead of firing on the synapse of bias and fear and hate, it fires on the synapse of love and opportunity and redemption. I think that if we were to fire on those synapses, I think we'll set a different change in motion and we do it for not 2 years or 4 years, but do it for 2 decades straight, then I think we'll see some real momentum change. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, because I have a semi-long list and a specific thing tonight. I'm going to talk very quickly. But one thing I just want to say is most counties are worse than Alameda for DA and sheriff, but we've got some challenges with the DA and sheriff in Alameda County, so that would really be helpful to do. All right, 3 things, or 3 categories, because there's multiple things in my 3. One is read New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I'm going to start with those 2 books. Right? Read those 2 books. If you're not moved to do anything after that, then check your pulse. But read those 2 books, and that just would go a long way. Second, locally, just as one throw out. So there are a number of local efforts. So I don't know if JCRC is a part of OCO, Oakland Community Organizations, but it's a group of congregations of all different faiths in Oakland. They're part of the statewide PICO network, which are very active in advocacy and activism around criminal justice and many other issues, economic income disparity issues. But one of the things that they specifically do is have every Friday night a night walk, walking through neighborhoods that are challenged with violence and crime and poverty every Friday evening, and they bring congregation members from all different faiths from around the city, around the area, to walk every Friday night, 6:30 to 8:30, and that's a part of OCO, Oakland Community Organization. Secondly, there is a local advocacy coalition, now calls in its 3rd name, Justice Reinvestment Initiative, and it's a bunch of local juvenile justice and criminal justice advocacy groups that I work with from time to time to do extraordinary work. Some is putting pressure. The current focus is the sheriff and DA and the board of supervisors for Alameda County. We do a lot of focus and protest at the city council, but the county board, which runs all of criminal justice and has purse strings in the county, doesn't get a lot of attention. Third, something I'm directly involved in as a co-coordinator is something called the California Alliance for Youth and Community Justice. If you think you're particularly interested, especially after reading the books, and really interested in reform and advocacy, this is a group that really is working toward reform, and I'm going to talk specifically lastly of the one thing we're working on now that I'm going to ask you all to participate in tonight. But if you want more, it's CAYCJ.org. www.caycj.org. It's specifically around juvenile justice reform throughout the state. But when we formed about 4 years ago, we had a priority. The overall goal is to reduce the size of the system and improve the outcomes of youth in the system. But we specifically focused on removing children from the adult criminal justice system. So there's about 250,000 youth around the country, children who are placed in the adult system. California is one of the worst places because in 2000, Prop 21 was passed, which said prosecutors, district attorneys can make the decision of which children get charged and tried and incarcerated as adults. And as young as 14, you go to the jail for the rest of your life, prison for the rest of your life. So the Alliance worked on a part of this initiative that would say prosecutors no longer have this authority. Judges will make the decision about which youth would be tried. So a lot of us would like it for this not to happen. There's some extreme cases where we can argue about, but this ballot initiative, if on the ballot and passed, would remove prosecutors making the decision and put the decision in the hands of judges and tweak the criteria by which they're making that decision. The governor joined this effort and added his own sentencing reform, which basically tries to undo the thing he did when he was governor before in the 70s and determined the sentencing. And so we talked about enhancements before. Enhancement means you get convicted of a crime, and that baseline crime, say burglary, but they determine you're in a gang. So in addition to the 5 years you're going to get for burglary, you're going to get 10 more years because you're in a gang, and now your sentence is 15 years. And so on that example that I gave, you could be eligible, not get out, eligible for parole at that 5 years instead of the 15 years. Not super extraordinarily progressive, but a good step in the right direction. But the other great thing it does is say you can, the prison system can change the way it does credit. So, but I need to go quick. I'm sorry I'm taking time on this. is in order to get on the ballot, we need signatures. I forgot to bring them with me. You may have seen me get a package when I got on the stage. I text somebody I know who had signatures. Thank God he was next door. And he brought me a package of signatures. So I would love that if anybody's interested in this just getting on the ballot, it would make the decisions for judges, not prosecutors, who are elected to be hard on crime and that negative synapses, and it would let folks get a parole eligibility who served their base term in prison. And so I have a bunch of petitions, and I would love for folks to sign it when we're done, and if not, you can start passing around now.
All right, and we're over time, and Alison, I'd like to give you the last one.
Everything that's been said here is great. Individually, find a way to make contact with the kid. And I'll tell you that what I do when I'm working with my clients is I always think about presenting a paradigm for problem solving. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter how much math you do with the kid. It doesn't matter how much reading you do with the kid. What matters is, do you give them a paradigm for problem solving and this is going to be counterintuitive for people, a boundaried relationship. Boundaried relationships. Families that are chaotic do not have boundaried relationships. That means I'm here to do your math with you. I'm not here to talk about everything else. I'm not your parent. I'm not your friend. I am your math tutor. And what you do with your math tutor is your math. You are going to want to do everything else and answer every question. Trust me, you can't. What you can do is present a boundary relationship and present paradigms for problem solving, impulse control and problem solving. So that's one thing each and every one of us can do. Second thing I would say is, well, take anything Mark Leno is doing and support it. But what you should really do is decide what you want to dig into. These are all really complex issues. If they were easy, we would have answered it. The people in the California legislature, by and large, they're really good people. And most of them are pretty smart. They're complex issues, and we need people to dig in and think about serious answers. Whether you want to take on, Leno's got a new bill about, about transparency, police transparency. It's a great bill. It's going to be really hard to get passed. It would be lovely to see folks come in. But really show up, sit through those interminable city council meetings and get them to focus on things that matter instead of whether or not it matters that you reorder the agenda. Trust me, it doesn't matter. But we really need people who are serious and engaged to do that hard work. And a lot of these issues can be addressed on a local level. They really can. You just have to be willing to sit through those interminable meetings and get them to focus on what matters. So with that,
thank you. I want to please give it up for our guests. We are aware that there were many more questions, and we will get to this is a multi-part series around racial justice, and because this is a learning opportunity, this is the best kind of class where we learn a lot. We will leave with a lot of things to think about. We get some homework from our guests that we should get into, and the exciting thing is we get to come back for more. I want to transition to Jessica, but I want to thank you all for your attention, and again, thank you to our guests.
So, crime statistics are going to go up. I guarantee it because of regression to the mean. It doesn't matter if you know what I mean, just trust the mic. Crime statistics in the state of California are going to go up. I guarantee it. It's called regression to the mean. They've been abnormally low. They're going to go up. Do not buy into more laws and penalties when that happens. It is a statistical fact. They will go up. And we need good people to say this does not mean we need bigger guns, harsher laws, more people in prison.